happy to introduce the last, not least, keynote speaker of this conference. I'll introduce you to Professor Evangelos KOURDIS, who is, as far as I know, the only professor of translation semiotics in the French language and literature faculty of the Faculty of Philosophy, the School of French Language and Literature, in the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. He teaches social linguistics and semiotic aspects of translation and many other courses, and dietology and education in the Hellenic Open University. He's the national representative of Greece in the International Association for Semiotic Studies, and he's vice president of the Hellenic Semiotic Society, and he's director of the Laboratory of Semiotics of the Faculty of Philosophy. And he has written several books, and is also part of the scientific board of the journal Digital Age of Semiotics and Communication. So I'm very happy to give the floor to Professor KOURDIS. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. In recent decades, there has undoubtedly been a great interest in the nature of cultural texts, which in turn places the issue of their composition at the heart of scientific debate. In this context, the notion of multimodality, a relatively recent concept, has contributed to a resurgence of interest mostly in the tools of semiotics and much less in its theories, leading the semiotic-derived theory of multimodality to evolve into a school of study with a content relatively autonomous from that of semiotic theory. The former was a theory that was received with particular enthusiasm, primarily by humanistic, pedagogical and visual studies, which felt that they could capitalize theoretically on this particular theory of semiotic origin, possibly because earlier semiotic theories were more complex, that is, more analytical and formalized. It is worth noting that although Kress and Valuven have based their proposal on the positions of leading semioticians such as Bart, Eco and Jacobson, the theory of multimodality seems to have taken a different path from semiotic tradition as such. According to Kress and Valuven, Bart's influence seems to have been particularly significant. I quote them, "Three writers influenced our ideas in different and fundamental ways. One is Roland Barthes. Although we see our work as going beyond his seminal writings on visual semiotics in several ways, he remains a strong inspiration. There is not a subject in semiotics on which Barthes has not written originally and inspiringly. He has provided us a model of what semiotics can be in the range of his interests, in the depth of his work, and in his engagement with the social and cultural world. However, the impact of Barthes' work on the theories of multimodality was not accompanied by the adoption of his conceptual tools, an element that would create a direct link with the tradition of semiotics. Perhaps this is due to the misinterpretation of his positions. Kress and Valuven argue that Barthes' account misses an important point. The visual component of a text is an independently organized and structured message connected with the verbal text, but in no way dependent on it, and similarly, the other way around. The starting point of the two scholars, though, seems to be inaccurate, since Barthes possesses the following question in his article Rhetoric of the Image. Does the image duplicate certain of the information given in the text by a phenomenon of redundancy? Certain of the information given in the text, but she also claims that the sign stands in a relation of redundancy with the connoted sign of the linguistic message. The aforementioned phenomenon of redundancy can be easily combined with intersemiotic translation and shows the connection between the two semiotic systems, language and image, contradicting thus Kress and Valuven's thesis that one system is not connected to the other. The conception of autonomy of the two scholars from the field of semiotics resulted in its conceptual differentiation, resulting in a conceptual confusion in semiotics and translation studies regarding the terms multimodal and polysemiotic or multisemiotic, with the latter two being related to the number of semiotic systems operating in the cultural text. Weber mentions that the polysemiotic is a semiotic product that brings together two or more semiotics. There are also competing terms, more or less synonymous, such as pluricode and syncretic. As concerns multimodal, Crescent Van defines it as the different modes through which texts are constructed so with social differences, so that in a multimodal text using images and writing, the writing may carry one set of meanings and the images carry another. Certainly, both terms, multimodal and polysemiotic or multisemiotic, connote the presence of several semiotic systems in a cultural text. But these semiotic systems, although different image, color, layout, typography, graphic design, may belong to the same mode or sensory channel, for instance, the visual one. Thus, in a printed advertisement, linguistic message, iconic message, color, typography, graphic design, proxemics usually coexist, but all these different semiotic systems are categorized in the same way, in the same mode, that is vision. This confusion over the use of the term modus versus semiotic and consequently multimodal versus multisemiotic is also highlighted by O'Halloran, as we will see later on. What is interesting in this particular case is that the synergy or coexistence of semiotic systems or modes or resources in a cultural text has been the subject of semiotics since the 50s, through the studies of print advertising or cinema, and today plenty of other cultural texts are studying the audiovisual texts, many of which Barthes included in his mythologies. Barthes' early engagement with the multimodal cultural texts of his time, such as Cats, treatise, or cinema, which he even characterizes as spectacle, en français spectacle, may have aimed in very ideological use, but Barthes did not cease to study them as a set of signs, as a whole. Lenin and Martin argue that multimodal analysis is different to former kinds of semiotics, such as that of Roland Barthes, which tend to look at individual signs and they assemble more direct meanings in terms of what they signify. And a multimodal approach will be interesting in the way that signs are used in combination, adding up to a whole. Structural semiotics, however, may be interesting in the synthesis of messages of communication, but nowhere does it follow that it cannot stand the cultural text as a whole. Instead, it is by knowing the composition of the semiotic system, which consists of subsystems, that we are able to know how they work together to produce meaning. Even semioticians, who were not part of the structural semiotics tradition, spoke of subsystems as part of a larger science system that they studied as a whole. Thus, Lodman also speaks of subtexts. For Lodman, all culture is a text containing many other kinds of texts. For him, the text within the text is a specific rhetorical construction in relation to which the difference in codification of the different parts of the text starts to reveal the author's construction and the reader's perception of the text. Eco also attempted to categorize semiotic systems in his theory of semiotics, using, in addition to the term signs and codes, the terms communicative processes and cultural systems. At the same time, Eco, when defining semiotics as studying all cultural processes as processes of communication, clearly claims that semiotics is interested in studying any cultural text as a whole. But in multimodality theory, we can see that its basic concepts, such as mode, are divided. Gabriel, for instance, mentions that a main mode can incorporate various submodes. As concerns Lenin and Martin, in their attempt to explain the contribution of multimodality theory turn their attention to its differentiation from the pursuits of linguistics. Thus, letting and Martin explain that what multimodality brings that is different and highly useful for all researchers of the visual is the idea that all forms of communication need to be approached with the same attention to detail as has been established in linguistics. While linguists are often unaware of much academic work in the visual, the opposite lack of engagement in linguistics in more systematic procedures for analyzing language is true for many media, cultural studies, and film researchers. However, while letting and Martin refer to the neglect of the study of visual communication by linguists, they fail to mention that semiotics did the opposite, making non-linguistic communication the focus of its study. Although most semioticians who have studied visual communication have come to the conclusion that language is the primary semiotic system in communication, they proceeded, even from the beginning of the second half of the 20th century, to study this field of research extensively, perhaps more than other disciplines at the time. Therefore, the question that arises is what more the theory of multimodality offers to the study of contemporary cultural texts. If it is a methodology, it is worth studying in depth. If, however, it is a scientific position that while more established disciplines such as linguistics, semiotics, and musicology engage primarily with those semiotic resources that fail with their respective conceptual needs, multimodality thus investigates the synergies between co-occurring semiotic resources, as Gonzalez claimed. One should note that the synergy of semiotic systems lies in the heart of the French school of semiotics, a structural semiotic school. Ernest Gonzalez, while discussing synergy, claims without realizing that the goal of multimodality identifies with that of semiotics, since according to Eco, the diversity of continuum is a fundamental problem for every theory of semiotics. Martin and Chen clearly admit that semiotics has been familiar with the different forms of communication long ago. They argue that, of course, to scholars with any knowledge of semiotics or working in the field of media studies, photography studies, or film studies, the idea that communication is multimodal will be rather obvious, and there is at least a century worth of studies and theories of the visual and film. However, the two scholars insist on linking social semiotics only to linguistics and not to the visual semiotics tradition, arguing that social semiotics has been applied to all manner of communicative forms such as images, film, monuments, photojournalism, and art. This seems to be a rather optimistic position, considering that Crescent by Leuven clearly notice that in the book we have, by and large, confined our exams to visual text objects from Western cultures and assume that this generalization has some validity as it points to a communication situation. It is not a universal grammar. Visual language, according to them, is not, despite assumptions to the contrary, transparent and universally understood. It is culturally specific. Optimism has without doubt always been a scientific virtue. At least as far as I know, semiotics has tried to be precise in its scientific pursuits in order to avoid being accused of what Eco called a theory of the lie. Since when a discipline defines everything as its proper object, according to Eco, and therefore declares itself as concerned with the entire universe and nothing else, it's playing a risky game. What now with the conceptual confusion? The problem is further exacerbated if we take into account that multimodality theories do not adopt stable conceptual terms either, especially ones that could be consolidated and contribute to delimiting and identifying the field of multimodality. Thus, in addition to the term mode, terms such as code and resource, for example, are used. Adami clarifies that against the term code used in more traditional semiotic approaches, the label mode is preferred. But why? As a less stable, system-centered, and rule-governed epistemological take on communicative principles and practices. Indeed, the term mode proposed by Halliday is the basic term on which the theory of multimodality was based. Since Gerson by Leuven defined the concept of multimodality as the use of several semiotic modes in the design of semiotic product or event, together with a particular way in which these modes are combined. What is interesting is that this terminology is not stable and that other semiotic terms are also employed. Gerson by Leuven maintained that the key feature of multimodal texts is that they are defined as those whose meanings are realized through more than one semiotic code. O'Halloran uses the term multisemiotic to describe texts that deploy more than one semiotic resource. Furthermore, Adami uses the term mode to label all socially developed organized sets of resources for meaning making, including speech, writing, image, gaze, facial expression, music, proxemics, color, dress, architecture, and so on. But she also acknowledges that boundaries between modes are also not clear-cut. She regards mode as a flexible label useful if conceived as a heuristic one for analysis, rather than a set-in-stone categorization that reifies and essentializes semiotic resources and the many uses that social groups may make of them. The differentiation of the basic terms of multimodal theory from those of the presenting semiotics can be intentional, since while multimodality was proposed by two semioticians as a theory with a new rationale, it could not ignore the contribution of semiotics, until then, to the study of visual communication on which it focused. But even in translation studies, within which there is also the field of multimodal translation, Adami mentioned that while meaning remaking from one mode to another and from one media to another are two different and intertwined translation processes, the translation of text as products of meaning remaking involves more than translation from one mode to another. It involves translation as multimodal whole. So a new term appears now to speak in a multimodal translation about wholes. The fact that the theory of multimodality is modifying even its basic terms, such as mode, has an impact on the field that has a previous relationship on translation studies, due to the constant translation of contemporary cultural texts. These processes show that multimodality is even search of a conceptual framework. Perhaps this is the reason why Gambier believes that translation studies has doubts about its identity, hesitating between fragmentation into terms and consilience of concepts and methods. I have to stress that also translation studies is an interdisciplinary field. Ernest Gonzalez claims that translation studies has not yet managed to articulate clearly how semiotics and multimodality relate to one another. And he observes that, leaving aside the provision of terms that translation scholars use to designate their theoretical explorations of meaning-making, resources and practices, multimodality falls within the wider remit of semiotics. And he also argues that the lack of consensus on where the referential boundaries between seemingly interchangeable terms such as medium, mode, or sign system lie ultimately expose the need for a more comprehensive and sophisticated understanding of the semiotic fabric of translated and interpreted texts. One should note at this point that terminological and conceptual confusion in the subfields of semiotics is not a new phenomenon, since it already exists in many different fields of semiotics. Particularly in translation studies, Kind holds that translation scholars themselves intensify the problem by the conceptual choice they make. I quote Kant, "The contribution of a theory of multimodal communication for translation studies is the specification of the modality notion which Holtzman mentioned but did not elaborate it comprehensively. In addition, it can end the conceptual confusion that prevails in this area of translation studies. The right terminology that has emerged since Katerina Rai's introduction of the Samplicity, then audio-media, and finally multimedia text, has prevented a coordinated debate in translation studies based on a common definition. However, Kouros Mare, who accepts image, writing, layout, music, gesture, speech, image moving, soundtrack, and 3D objects as examples of modes, just as they were proposed by Kress, observes that it becomes confusing when Kress also sometimes talks about medium instead of mode, for instance, sometimes calling speech a mode, and sometimes calling it a medium. Whether the mode-medium debate is settled or not, the point for translation studies is that communication consists mostly of bundles of highly diverse features. Mare adopts here in translation studies, the expression bundles of highly diverse features used by Kress in his attempt to answer what a mode is. Kress adds that socially what counts as mode is a matter for a community and its social and representative needs. What the community decides and regard as mode is mode, according to Kress. On the other hand, Gottlieb refers to multi-channel messages as polysemiotic texts and gives emphasis to the five senses, arguing that the semiotic mapping of the landscape of translation is based on an analysis of which channels constitute originals and translations, and that not all translated texts use the same communicative channels as their originals. These general viewpoints may impact the reflections and fermenting of the field of multimodality, but they do not contribute to the process of defining its field. Nevertheless, the influence of multimodality theory on translation studies is particularly extensive. As Adami claims, in recent years, translation studies, along with much research in linguistics, as well as education and other disciplines in the humanities and social sciences, have been undergoing a multimodal turn, stemming from the recognition that communication is multimodal and humans make meaning with more than language. The same state of conceptual variation characterizes the subfield of audiovisual translation. Perez Gonzalez clearly defines audiovisual translation as the research field that focuses on the practices, processes, and products that are involved in or result from the transfer of multimodal and multimedia content across languages and or cultures. Nevertheless, scholars of audiovisual translation do not consistently use the terms of multimodality, as they are also use terms from semiotic theory, in the context of which a structuralist semiotician, as Romain Jacobson has proposed, the concept of semiotic translation or transmutation or transposition, a very useful concept for audiovisual translation. So, the use of multiple terms such as semiotic mode, semiotic means, semiotic system, semiotic channel, semiotic code, semiotic resource, semiotic coherence, semiotic complexity, intertextuality, polysemiotic field, intersemiotic translation, intersemiotic redundancy, and intersemiotic complementarity by audiovisual translation scholars seems to be more confusing in trying to clarify the relationship between semiotics, translation, and modality, rather than helping to delineate it. The fact that some concepts are used interchangeably accentuates the confusion. Gambier mentions that from now on, texts are fluid with other texts and other semiotic systems, fixed or moving images, graphs, colors, fonts, sounds, etc. A text has become polysemiotic or multimodal and exists in a permanent intertextual relationship with other texts. Gambier, an eminent scholar of audiovisual translation, uses here the term polysemiotic as synonymous to multimodal, and this certainly does not contribute to the debate on clarifying those terms, those issues. Gambier seems to perceive a distance between part studies and multimodal theory, and states that it is not time to argue who is right, but to observe that both approaches insist on the importance of taking into consideration the multiple modes of sense-making. I totally agree with him. Most likely, the difference between the two terms is not at the heart of the scholarly debate in translation studies or audiovisual translation, which simply make use of these terms to underline the complexity of contemporary cultural texts. But for semioticians, clarifying these terms helps to promote semiotics, especially with reference to clarifying theoretical positions in semiotics, which are put forward by multimodality theorists as new data. For example, Gambier's statement that today research on multimodality underlying the autonomy of the visual science has not only been demonstrated by Barth's study of the Banzani print advertisement, in which he distinguishes between linguistic messages, coded iconic messages, and non-coded iconic messages, but also by the Belgian Semiotic School of Liège, Group Mu. I don't know if Jean-Marie is here, he is here. To this end, Group Mu categorized non-verbal semiotic systems into iconic visual signs and plastic visual signs, such as color, form, and texture, moving even further by referring to the autonomy of the plastic sign within the iconic one. So sometimes we have the feeling that we say the same thing that we recover America. I don't know why. I think we will see that it is much easier to solve this situation. How we arrived from sign systems to modes. A common definition of multimodality, according to Jewett, as the full range of communication forms people apart from language, such as image, gesture, gaze, posture, and the relationship between them, is considered too general by some scholars, and also overlaps with other semiotic phenomena. This conceptual confusion has resulted in many scholars using one term instead of the other, with the term multimodality gaining ground in their preferences. This is true. Even in semiotic studies, the term multimodality is in fashion now. This conceptual confusion, it is also certain that the occasional conceptual proposals by the French semiotic school, interaction, fusion, jonction, synergie, syncrétisme, intersémioticité, transmutation, transposition, further complicate matters as to whether semiotic phenomenon takes place between semiotic systems, modes, and resources, or resources. It is true that the Tartu Moscow School of Semiotics has also shifted its interest from structural semiotics from the French School of Semiotics, which set the sign and the semiotic system as the object of study, to the study of the semiotic cultural text. In Tartu Moscow School, we speak about text, not about science. As already mentioned, Vincent Valuper relies heavily on the work of leading semioticians such as Barth, Eco, and Jacobson, and I will therefore begin to explore here the viewpoint of those who were also eminent thinkers of the French School of Semiotics. Starting from the first case, Barth, in his first analysis of a polysemiotic text, which was a print advertisement, refers to système de signes, to sign systems, signes, signs, and messages, message. For Barth, a system which takes over the signs of another system in order to make them its signifiers is a system of connotation. Although in his Manifesto of Semiotics, titled Éléments de sémiologie, he speaks of système de signification, signification systems, it is clear that in Barth, who influenced Kress and Valuper, not only there is no reference to terms such as mode and resources, but possibly the only common term that he shares with the work of this scholar is that of code. A beloved notion in semiotics, code, but ambiguous. We have to define it yet. Jacobson, for his part, seems to show preference to the term syncretic when referring to polysemiotic texts, although he also employs the more general term semiotic manifestations, manifestation semiotique. More specifically, after underlining the primary role of language several times, Jacobson states that the study of communication must distinguish between homogeneous messages, which use a single semiotic system, and syncretic messages based on a combination or measure of different sign patterns. For Jacobson, who was both a linguist and a semiotician, there was no obstacle to combining linguistics and semiotics in order to study syncretic communicative texts. Bearing in mind the basic stance of the French School of Semiotics, that translatability appears to be one of the fundamental properties of semiotic systems, according to Greimas and KOURDIS. Similarly, for Jacobson, all forms of communication are accompanied by certain verbal utterances or both semiotic manifestations or other semiotic manifestations or both. If they are not verbalized, they are all verbalizable, that is translatable into spoken or at least inner-verbal messages. It is worth mentioning that the term syncretic seems to be also adopted by two leading figures of the French school of semiotics, Greimas and KOURDIS, who argue that, in a broader sense, different semiotic systems, such as opera or cinema, will be considered syncretic when they implement several manifestation languages. Similarly, verbal communication is not only of a linguistic kind, since it also includes paralinguistic elements such as gestuality and proxemics, sociolinguistic elements, etc. It is worth mentioning that scholars of multimodality have a positive outlook on the term syncretic, since they claim that, according to Kress and Van, a syncretic text draws on several systems of semiotic resources, included but not limited to language, image, music, color, and perspective. They are often referred to as a multimodal text. They consider the syncretic text as multimodal text. Apart for the concept syncretic, the French semiotic school also uses the term synergy of semiotic systems. They speak about synergie de système sémiotique. Paret defines synergy as the coordinated action of several systems from which results the accomplishment of a function, the execution of a movement. Paret adds that synergy is an harmony of trends oriented by the same purpose and must be thought in the world of fusion. Leading figures of semiotics approach these two terms from different perspectives. For example, Paret argues that synergy and syncretism cannot be used interchangeably because the former must be thought as a fusion, while the latter as a type of junction. On the other hand, for Floss, the term syncretism seems to be a synonym for the term synergy. Floss states that syncretism is a capacity to establish a relationship between its different languages of manifestation in order to express the same idea, the same values. Moreover, Fabry favors the use of syncretism in a semiotic translation, claiming that this type of translation is a productive field of research that expands the field of semiotics by studying the articulations of meaning through different modes, substance, of expression. It is not therefore a question of separating different signifiers, visual, auditory, but of taking into consideration the syncretic character, to see it as a whole. And I have to say that Fabry is a member of the French-Italian structural semiotic school. More rarely, the term interaction between semiotic systems is used by semioticians such as Rastier and Judet-Mugel in order to describe the notion of intersemiosis. I believe, however, that this choice is an influence of the Anglo-Saxonic school. In contrast, Belgian semioticians of the French school use the term pluricode, thus criticizing the term syncretic discourse. Klinkenberg clearly spoke of pluricode discourse by referring to any family of utterances considered to be sociologically homogeneous for a given culture, but in which the description can isolate several utterances each belonging to a different code. For Klinkenberg, the word syncretic generally refers to a combination of elements that is not very coherent, and he continues by arguing that cinema, theatre, and opera are some examples of pluricode discourse. He also approaches the printed advertisement, which Roland Barthes studied in 1964, as a pluricode discourse which presents an interest for semiotic analysis. It seems, however, that the influence of the French semiotic school exerts on semioticians also affects the conceptual arsenal. For instance, Agopoulos and Papadopoulou avoid using the term mode and distinguish between simple semiotic systems and complex semiotic systems. It is obvious that even within the French semiotic school itself, different terms are used for the same semiotic phenomenon, which is typical, of course, of many research fields. Perez-Gonzalez claims that structuralist approaches privilege the conventional and static meaning of established signs and codes over the quotation of semiotic modes to form a negotiated change in relationship with other modes as required by the specific demands of communicative events. This is precisely what the social semiotic approach to multimodality attempts to do. Taking the above into account, I should note here that it is not clear to me why multimodal scholars claim to the structuralist that the structuralist approach cannot form a negotiated change in relationships, since in fact it has very early on described and studied transformations of relationships through terms such as semiosis and asemiosis, transmutation, transduction, contextuality, to mention but a few. Furthermore, one cannot fail to notice that despite using different terms, structuralist semioticians made no claim about joining a different field of semiotics. And of course, this comes in contact to scholars working with multimodality who have claimed a distinct viewpoint upon the object of semiotic study and even proposed the term social semiotics to highlight their stance. To this end, Perez-Gonzalez clearly states that the central concept in the social semiotic strand of multimodality is mode, which is defined as a socially safe and culturally given resource for making meaning. As examples of modes, Kress characterizes image, writing, layout, music, gesture, moving images, soundtrack. And it is understood that what Kress describes as mode are semiotic systems that rely on one or more senses. The latter, in fact, that is the field of the senses, is a one where, in my opinion, multimodality has a lot to offer. Nonetheless, I cannot fail to acknowledge that the earlier study of specific semiotic system did not lack the social and cultural dimension that lies at the heart of multimodal research. So, what happened with these two terms, in my opinion? This conceptual confusion continues to be present in translation studies. Perez-Gonzalez mentions that the iconic verbal link in written text is one of the most established areas of multimodal research in translation studies. But this study has not only been analyzed by semiotics in the 60s, but also in translation studies, much before the multimodality approach emerged. Furthermore, this issue is of particular concern to translation scholars who argue that if translation takes place in multimodal environments, then why not use the term multimodal translation instead of intersemiotic translation, instead of transmutation, instead of transposition? Even in this context, however, the term multimodal translation can be challenged by the term transduction between a range of semiotic modes, as Kress and Valuren have suggested. This reflection is also registered by translation scholars at a time when conceptual propositions succeed one another in translation studies. We speak about intermediality, transmediality, resemiotization, etc. Snell-Horby claims that intersemiotic translation is an integral element in multimedia and multimodal transfer, while in software localization or in translation for stage and screen. And Chesterman notes that research into these forms of multimodal translation shows how translation studies scholars have long been active within intersemiotic translation, albeit perhaps in a wider sense than Jacobson originally meant. To my mind, this is the reason why Perez-Gonzalez notes that translation studies have not yet managed to articulate clearly how semiotics and multimodality relate to one another. The conceptual problem of choosing between terms such as polysemiotic or multisemiotic and multimodal could be addressed more easily if we adopt O'Halloran's viewpoint that the term mode could be used to refer to the channel through which semiotic activity takes place, auditory, visual, or tactile, that is, to the senses, a diachronically challenging field for semioticians. Thus, according to O'Halloran, the term multisemiotic could be used for texts which are constructed from more than one semiotic resource, and multimodal for discourses which involve more than one mode of semiosis. O'Halloran's suggestion is in a contrast with Gottlieb's claim that any communicative system works through the combination of sensory signs, but also with Hebert's proposal to distinguish between the following notions: polysemiotic, using for several semiotics; polysensorial, using for several sensorialities, sight, touch, etc., and multimedia for several media. In this context, it is worth mentioning Hess's remark that reading the world through different senses, sight, touch, hearing, and even taste and smell, is always present in the reading, even when we ostensibly focus on script alone. And my concluding remarks and proposals. This speech is not intended to underestimate the contribution of multimodality theory to the study of contemporary cultural communication. On the contrary, by acknowledging the fact that it has revived the interest of several research fields in the relationship between language and image, linguistic and non-linguistic communication, multimodality theory has succeeded in making researchers interested in the historical developments of semiotic theory and its tools. I believe, however, that clarifying the key terms of multimodality will significantly contribute to avoiding confusion among researchers and among students sometimes, which often discourages them in their research, giving the impression that we are saying the same or almost the same thing, to recall a well-known expression that Ego used when speaking of translation. For example, it is difficult to accept Cambiè's position that today researchers on multimodality insist on the importance of taking into consideration the multiple modes of sense-making, taking into consideration that this has always been a basic premise of semiotics, namely that all semiotic systems are carriers of meaning, and that meaning is the result of the synergy of coexisting semiotic systems. Multimodality scholars claim that multimodality theory is a new approach. For instance, for Pérez González, multimodality is still in its infancy, but it does not seem to convince us that it brings anything supplementary or new to semiotic research and translation, unless, in my opinion, we adopt O'Halloran's viewpoint that the term mode with which multimodality researchers have replaced the term semiotic system and code refers to a cultural text not described or categorized by semiotics. This is why I speak about senses. Of course, the lesser senses in visual communication have been studied as carriers of meaning by semiotics since the mid-20th century. But it is true that audiovisual texts have never been as complex as they are today. In this case, the term multimodality or multimodal text could be replaced terms from semiotics such as syncretic text, which was mainly used for audiovisual texts of film, theatre, and opera. Unless we accept some form of groundwork for the conceptual categorization of today's complex communication, such as O'Halloran's sensory-based one, we will continue to have problems understanding the function of cultural texts. This is also perpetuated the difficulty of them being studied by contemporary scholars, as scarce and valuable when they characterized as multimodal texts a film, an audiovisual text, but also a newspaper, a text based obviously on a single sense, and possibly on the second one if the reader touches the newspaper, and the third one if the reader additionally smells the newspaper. But this distinction must be made by multimodality scholars. O'Sullivan recommends that scholars should move in the same direction when she argues that the saturated multimodality of many texts today would require both a new or at least a rethought critical and analytical toolbox and potentially also new approaches to translation. Conclusively, clarifying how key terms of multimodality, such as mode and resource, differentiate themselves from well-established terms in semiotics will contribute to the study of contemporary cultural texts that are constantly being translated from one to another and will certainly be an important contribution for both semiotics and translation studies. And I would like to thank you for your presence here.
thank you so much. That was such a clear articulation, you know, over lots of different work about all the debates that's gone on about terminology. Very thorough and very well thought out, so thanks for that. It's driven me to exasperation, I think that was one of the terms you used, someone used today, about all these different terms. And I think, you know, what you've come to conclude, I think is really important, because you've got semiotic systems, semiotic resources, semiosis, but there's a material basis to it. And that's where the senses come in, because we have to sense the sign, you know, and that's why, you know, so you've got the semiotic resources like you've got language, but it depends whether it's spoken or whether it's written, and that's where the senses come in. You're using your sight to look at it, or you're using your ears to hear it. But that comes back then to the overarching framework, I think, you know, where you've got semiotic systems being the most complex, you've got their social, because meanings are exchanged within social context. Then you've got the biological, which is a human, and the senses. And then you've got the physical, which is the materiality of the sign. And often we forget about the materiality, and that's where the senses come in. Would that make sense to you?
I think senses could be the only answers about that. But
Sorry.
senses is, in my opinion, is the only answer to that.
Yes.
Because the confusion is so much that we have a great problem in translation studies. And we have confusions because, of course, translation is a cultural discipline. So the biological dimension is not, we are not interested in the biological dimension. But we need it in order to understand how the senses can help us to understand the multimodal text. This is why I said it is more complex now, and perhaps this complexity could be expressed to a new term such as multimodal text.
Yeah. Yeah, 3 different modes, 3 expressions on the site and whatever.
In my thought, it is like something like that.
Yeah. When I was doing the work on mathematical discourse, like that was 205, that's quite a long time ago, I was looking at written text, and that's why I called it
I think it's a very, very useful book. This one.
Oh, thank you. Oh, no,
Helped me a lot.
well, I was calling it multi-semiotic because at that time, really multimodal wasn't used a lot. But then I realised through the senses, okay, well, you know, like, and Halliday always said this with mode being spoken and written. So I thought, okay, that makes sense. The senses have got to come in. You know, I was dealing with multi-semiotic texts, which were maths written text, which you looked at, and you can touch, I agree. And then moving on to other things, that's where the multimodal came in, spoken versus written, and that comes back to the materiality of the sign and the way that we as human beings, perceive and process the different signs that we have. And then you've got the sort of the social, because of course semiosis is social as well, and then you've got the semiotic signs. So thanks so much, that was brilliant.
Thank you. Other interventions?
Thank you very much for this very important lecture, which is really a literature review of the whole tradition and advance the understanding of how multimodality and semiotics
I believe you exaggerate.
Sorry?
You exaggerate. It's not a presentation of all the literature.
Well, for a not really more young researcher as me, that now I don't have time to read all this text, was really useful, so thank you for that. But beside the compliment, so let's go to the question which is really more important. As you know, there is also ethno-semiotic approach that originates also from some ideas from Paolo Fabbri that use text as a methodological tool. For example, also in my research I use that. I'm the author and I define the borders of the research object that I want to study. For example, I don't know, monuments and memorial of the 20th century and the practices around the meaning, right? I wonder, since you also said, that to include in the semiotic domain all the objects is risky, as Umberto Eco used to say. Where is the limit, where we can stop to analyze everything as text? So we can do, textual semiotics, we can do narrative semiotics, we can look at landscape as text, we can look at built environment as text, we can look and so on and so forth. But where is the limit? Where is the threshold? in your opinion, if I may? Thank you very much.
You are right, Federico, but as you know, it was difficult even to London to find the boundary in the semiospheres. So, in my opinion, as concerns the new term, the introduction of new terms, the scholars that propose these terms must to define them. So, in order to have if we have the definition, we have the boundary. For instance, personally, I use the term in semiotic system and multimodal only if I combine and I explain what O'Halloran said about senses. Otherwise, we have a confusion because we use one term instead of the other. There is not a boundary. But if colleagues such as David and Kay explain the boundaries of these new terms, because Jewett has a different approach to that, totally different from what I have read. It will help us to understand what is the meaning, because as a semiotician I cannot propose a new term that other colleagues use and propose in their research. This is why I said the multimodality scholars must explain what is the basic notion and what is the content of this basic notion. I think this is ethical, not to give my opinion to a term that already has made a great confusion, because in translation studies there is a great debate. Everybody says multimodal texts, we have multimodality now, we are interested in images, but it is something that semiotics said from the 50s. It's not something new, but they don't know semiotics. They know multimodality, but they don't know that multimodality is a semiotic theory. They don't know the basis. They think that it's something new. And they said, semiotics is too difficult, but multimodality is very well for us. And I said, but multimodal theory is a semiotic theory. And they said, no, multimodal theory is easy. It's like semiotics. Is it possible to accept that? I don't know. I don't accept it.
But, want to...
Thank you for your talk. I was wondering if it would be important to consider, in fact, perception, since we're talking about the senses and how we could solve this confusion, so to speak, in terminology with the senses. Would it be useful to go back to human perception, to understand how human perception works, maybe through cognitive sciences and so forth? So to go a little deeper into how that works. I don't know your opinion on that.
In translation studies, we consider, as in semiotics, that all cultural processes are cognitive processes. But I'm not specialized in cognitive translation or cognitive linguistics. I have only this general viewpoint, because translation semiotics is my field of research. If Göran Sonson tried to combine cognitive semiotics with translation, and he proposed it as a model of communication, that translation, if we approach it as a communication actor, yes, we can use all this cognitive tradition, but it is his research of his field of research, not mine, because for senses, for instance, there is a great bibliography in the French tradition, but the majority of them, they are from in the literature. Fontanilly, you can understand all this tradition of the French school. They study senses in a different way. Some years ago, Christian, in Sozopol, they placed the interest to the senses in films, if I remember well. It was a nice try to see also what is happening to other kinds, to audiovisual texts, but the tradition in semiotics concerning senses is usually how we translate them, how we see it in literature, what are the representations connected with the senses. But in translation, it is something that we have to discover how it works, because translation studies is so interdisciplinary that sometimes there are colleagues that say translation studies is not in your field, it is linguistics. Others they say, no, it is comparative literature. Some others says, no, translation studies could be limited only to language. Translation scholars say that no, we need image, because when we cannot translate using language, we need image. And then they start a discussion, how we call it. We call it intersemiotic translation, transmedial translation, multimodal translation. They like multimodality a lot. But I think that they have, they're confused about the terms because they don't know. Translation scholars usually they come either from linguistics, either from literature, and they don't have this common background. Because as a sociolinguist, I have a semiotic background, so it helped me to move more and to say what Greimas said, that sociolinguistics is a theory that we can call it sociosemiotics, that you could also examine food, dress, the way we are dressing, the movements. So I have a very broad sense of what sociolinguistics is, but it's not the usual case. The majority of the translation scholars, they believe that translation is only language. Now, 20 years, the last 20 years, they started, because the theorists of translation said, no, we need image, we need audiovisual text, we speak about intermediality, so we have to discover who is saying that. They started from semiotics, but they are afraid of semiotics. They find it too complicated. And they said, I will not using that, multimodality is much better. And I'm astonished. But this is my perspective. Perhaps other colleagues or in other countries, there are different approaches and different research fields. I don't know.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I will take advantage to make a question to Evangelos. And it sounds like this. Do you have any valid argument not to feel threatened by the automatic translation, by the artificial intelligence as the future of translation, as far as there are predictions that in 20 years there will be only machine translation, and even worse, now it's already beginning to make a multimodal translation. For instance, yesterday we saw this presentation of Andre who put the images based on the topics of the slides, and it's getting better and better to translate one medium into another and to create really multimodal outcomes of translation queries. So are there valid arguments to consider our semiotic translation studies, let's say, that will last, or the machine translation will change entirely the game, so we will have to study informatics in order to say something relevant on translation?
I cannot answer because there are colleagues that are specialized either in computational linguistics or computational semiotics or localization. And they're studying this research field, and I don't know their position about that. Because as semiotics is a cultural theory, I remain to the basis of semiotics in order to create further confusions. Perhaps you are right, because they said that we need multimodality because we have internet. All texts are now in internet texts or they are digitalized texts. So digitalization goes hand by hand with multimodality. I have heard that, but I don't know how they approach multimodality and how if there is an added value for them. They believe that it is an added value, but I don't know how they use it. Yes.
Okay.
But we have better results now in Google Translate. This is true, that the situation is much better than in the past. And with DeepL translation also, we have much better results now, especially concerning the languages such as English, French, Italian and German. The major languages, the minor, not the minor, the major languages of the European Union. But with the minor languages, we have still problems.
Okay, so let's see. Other observations, questions? If we don't have, I think we can say thank you to